known her for about 10 years. She's a senior executive with, I think, with over 30 years of experience in global pharma, as well as in the information sectors. She has been building businesses, she has been growing businesses around the globe, and quite importantly, driving operational success. She's held senior roles in Europe, in APAC region, as well as in China. In fact, in the APAC region is where we first met when she was running IMS Health for the entire APAC region, overseeing, I think, Deborah, at least 16 countries, yeah?
Correct, yes, big territory.
Yeah, big area, including also China. A subject matter expert in business intelligence as well as in data monetization, and CEO of Evaluate Pharma since 2019. We're privileged to have you with us, talking about some predictions for 2022 for Biopharma. If you're lucky, we will also get Paul Sims logging in. And Paul, of course, you know. Yeah, so Paul is particularly vocal and provocative in his predictions. He made a couple of them, was it last week, I think, yeah? And I hope that he is also able to join us today. So with that said, Deborah, it is now 3:03, so let's wait another couple of minutes before we start. Anything did you like to say to the group or to us?
I'm very much looking forward to the presentation today. Very kind introduction there, Salman. So really looking forward to taking everybody through the presentation, which I will say up front has been prepared with the help of my excellent team at Evaluate. So hopefully it will generate plenty of food for thought today.
They've done an excellent job. It's a really, really rich presentation. There's so much information there in the presentation that, you need to, it's one of those presentations that you cannot just sort of look at it once.
Indeed, yeah.
You do need to go through it 2 or 3 times, and then it kind of begins to sink in.
Yeah. Well, hopefully as I take everybody through, we'll be able to put a little bit of colour on that, and as you say, people can then reflect on it after the presentation as well. There's certainly a lot of information in there, yes.
Yeah.
May I ask real quick, this is Christoph, will we get a copy of the presentation, or is this going to be recorded today?
Well, you have to talk to me, Christoph, and I will tell you the price for that. No, of course you will get it.
All right.
No, of course you will get it. I mean, we will have it. We will have a copy of the recording and as well as the presentation.
Thank you.
On our closed LinkedIn site. Now, before Deborah takes the floor, I just want to say one thing, that we will be running today's meeting under Chatham House rules, which means that Deborah will make the presentation, and the Q&A section is going to be governed by Chatham House rules, which means that you can ask any questions, anybody can comment, but we will not assign questions or answers to any particular person. Yeah, I will make sure that I'm monitoring the chat box. We will have a Q&A session. So we will let Deborah do the presentation, and after the presentation, we'll then go into the Q&A section. But please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. And with that, Deborah, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Salman. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for letting me be part of the Healthcare Dialogues community today. It really is super to be here. As you've heard from Salman, obviously my name is Deborah Kobewka, and I am the Chief Executive Officer at Evaluate. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Evaluate, but just in case anybody isn't, Evaluate provides the life sciences industry with data, insight, and intelligence that really facilitates confident decision-making around high-value investments in treatments and markets. Basically, the way we think about our world is that we're here to make life easier for our customers. How do we do that? Well, obviously, we provide our customers with best-in-class data sets. We also have great analytical powers and expert knowledge as well, which really helps to transform thinking around asset valuation and ultimately enable you to make strategic portfolio decisions that, of course, improve patient outcomes. Obviously, we're not here really to talk about Evaluate today. Today, what I want to talk about, though, is the future, and specifically 2022, and what that holds for Biopharma. And so great timing as we're right at the beginning of the year. I'm going to be sharing some of our data-driven analysis that comes from Evaluate, as well as some of the insights that we get from investors and from market participants on key developments around the sector. Now, of course, the elephant in the room is, of course, COVID-19. We all know it's just not going to go away, and it's going to remain a front-page story for, throughout this year and probably beyond, and it's going to keep the industry right in the spotlight for the foreseeable future. But aside from COVID-19, there is a lot more going on, and we want to look at how will Biopharma extend beyond the pandemic response? How is the industry going to focus on innovation and regulation? And what are the critical developments in the world of money markets, M&A, and more? So those are the things that we're going to focus on today. I think it's probably fair to say that the business of pharma will continue. It's an amazingly resilient sector, and we've seen that through the pandemic. I think what we're looking at in 2022 is what we're seeing elsewhere in the world, that the sector and pharma is learning to live with COVID while trying to get back to business as usual. So what does that mean? Obviously, the vaccine makers have done really well for themselves. For the rest of the industry, things are starting to come back slowly as we learn to live with COVID. I think we're going to see a lot of pent-up demand in some areas, more areas of advanced diseases, particularly as people have had to wait longer to get treatment. And it's possible that there's going to be a rise in probably more complex cardiovascular challenges as a result of long COVID. And then finally, there's the matter of money. Inflation is soaring around the world, and that's a huge issue for pharma, just as it is for other industries. It's going to put a real spotlight on drug prices, and of course that's particularly in the US. And then when you add in interest rates and the increases that we're expecting to see, and the end of cheap money that's actually bankrolled much of the industry for the past years, I think we're going to have a really interesting mix in 22. So with that theme of learning to live with COVID, let's get into a little bit more context.
Just very quickly, Deborah, the slides don't seem to be moving. So, Karen, are you having any challenges with moving the slides?
I am moving them on, but if they're not showing for you, then
no.
We're only seeing the first slide.
Oh no, I've moved on about 6 slides since then. So
no, we've not seen. Nobody has seen them.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry, they're moving on my screen, so I wasn't aware that wasn't working. Bear with me.
All right, so let's start with the inevitable COVID-19. As I said earlier, the pandemic is far from over, and it's going to continue to ensure that all eyes are on pharma this year. Almost 2 years in, unbelievably, things are still evolving rapidly on all fronts, politically, economically, and of course pharmacologically as well. Late last year, sales forecasts started to emerge for Paxlovid, which is obviously Pfizer's oral antiviral, and that looks like it could be one of 2022's biggest selling products. Having approved the first COVID-19 antiviral at the start of November, Ridgeback Therapeutics and Merck's Largevrio, the UK regulator has now approved also Pfizer's Paxlovid. It's available as a 5-day oral course for patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 who are at an increased risk of developing severe disease. Now, clearly, that is great news. However, that was before the Omicron variant came along, and the MHRA has said that it is still too early to know whether the variant has any impact on Paxlovid's effectiveness, and investigations are underway. The other big challenge is supply, which may not stretch as far as might be ideal. Pfizer said before Christmas that it was only able to supply a total of 2.7 million doses to the UK throughout 2022. But as I've said before, it's not all COVID. Biopharma's activities this year will extend far beyond the pandemic response. And at Evaluate, we've recently published our Evaluate Vantage preview report, and that's based on data from Evaluate and also interviews with investors and participants from right across the sector. The report outlines themes and issues that look set to dominate us in 2022. So let's truly move on from COVID, if only we could, and look at what else we will have in the industry, which we should be focused on this year. So first up, let's take a look at drugs which will grow Biopharma's top line during 2022. In news that will surprise no one, vaccines against COVID-19 will continue to make billions this year, bringing in at least 50 billion in combined revenue for Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna. Now, Moderna, if you recall, took a little while to accelerate manufacturing, which got them off to a little bit of a slow start. And so we expect in 22 that their vaccine sales are going to surpass what they booked in 21. And currently, 22 sales of Pfizer and BioNTech are forecast to dip compared to 21, which explains why Comirnaty does not feature in the biggest new sales generators. However, of course, that outlook is by no means set in stone, and we have to see how the pandemic continues to run. As I've said previously, it's not all about COVID. As the industry works its way back to business as usual, what are the other drugs that are going to have a major impact? Well, AbbVie's anti-rheumatic Humira is forecast to remain the biggest selling drug, but 22 will be its last year of, shall we say, largesse, with biosimilars set to arrive in the US by 2023, and almost certainly that will have the inevitable impact on market share and revenues. This challenge will hand pole position to Keytruda, the Merck & Co cancer antibody. Keytruda is still adding billions of new sales each year due to the company's success in broadening the drug's label. Opdivo, Dupexnet and Eliquis also feature in both charts, underlining the strength of these huge mega blockbusters. And looking at the biggest new generators, AbbVie's rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis products, so that's Ritvoq and Skyrizi, both feature in the biggest new sales generators chart. This is a really promising sign of the progress that's being made in replacing Humira's sales, which currently make up over 60% of AbbVie's turnover. Having said that, the outlook for the group's JAK inhibitor, Rinvoq, is increasingly uncertain thanks to some safety concerns that could cap the potential of the whole class, actually. A big focus this year will be watching how stringently the FDA deals with pending approvals for this and other JAK inhibitors. So let's take a look at the companies that will lead the pack. This is the view, and that adds to the product perspective to give you a really rounded view. Almost inevitably, the huge success of Comirnaty will make Pfizer the world's biggest drug maker by prescription sales this year, by a comfortable margin as well. The COVID-19 vaccine is expected to sell at least 29 billion during 22, accounting for nearly half of the company's projected prescription sales. And AstraZeneca stands out in the biggest new sales generators following the 2020 Alexion acquisition. Also, its cancer franchise is expanding really swiftly, though, with oncology products Tagrisso and Lynparza really leading on the growth there. And GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, is a really interesting one. I think it's fair to say that despite deep concerns about its growth prospects, the company features in both top 10 charts. However, of course, a lot's going to depend on the rebound in demand for a shingles vaccine, Shingrix. Prescriptions were really seriously curbed by the pandemic as people were quite reluctant to venture out and to get the vaccine. So there is a question mark here. And hopefully, as people start to feel safer, we're going to see a return to the previous levels of uptake this year. Finally, Eli Lilly is notable by its absence. The company features really heavily in analysis to come a little bit later on in my presentation. But given that it's the owner of two of the sector's most valuable pipeline projects, firstly, its cancer drug Alimta will lose patent protection this year, but diabetes drug tirzepatide and donanemab, an Alzheimer's treatment, might enable Lilly to deliver really strong growth in years to come. More of that in a moment. So let's talk a little bit about R&D. Obviously, research and development is at the heart of the industry, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at the projects that we think it's worth keeping an eye on this year. And for me, this is actually the stuff I get really excited about, because as well as giving you a glimpse into the future, it's also an area where Evaluate has some really interesting and unique insights. So what's in store? Well, there's several potential blockbusters lined up to reach the market in 2022. And Alzheimer's disease is really poised to provide plenty of regulatory news. In fact, just in the past week or so, we've seen a lot of news in that area. Both Lilly and Roche are striving to join Biogen on the market with their respective projects. Although whether this will happen this year depends a lot on the FDA's continuing support for accelerated approvals, and indeed on Roche's willingness to file biomarker data. A third amyloid beta agent is Eisai's lecanemab. That sits just outside the top 10 that I shared in the first table. The Biogen partnered map is also in the running for a speedy nod this year. However, as we've seen with recent decisions from the US Centers for Medicare and Medicaid's services on funding of Aduhelm, regulatory success might be very different from commercial success for all of these drugs, with the reimbursement bar now set a lot higher than in the wake of the controversy surrounding Aduhelm's approval. Now, Bristol-Myers Squibb is an interesting one as well. The company has two big pipeline hopes for approval this year and is under pressure to convince investors that it can navigate its fast-approaching Revlimid patent cliff. The immune-oncology, or IO space as I'll call it, could also see the arrival of several follow-on anti-PD-1 and PD-L1 MAPs in the US, with the FDA due to decide on Lilly Innovent's Tyvyt in March, and also the Novartis Biogen tislelizumab in July. Sales forecasts for these two products are not particularly high, but their arrival could herald the start of a price competition in the cancer space, which is, of course, highly lucrative. In fact, as I've mentioned, with inflation becoming a big issue, any sort of price competition in the space is going to have a real impact. And in fact, more broadly, the threat of low-cost competition in previously high-cost therapy areas like cancer and immunology is a theme that's really likely to develop over 2022. And I would suggest it's certainly an area that we want to keep an eye on. Now, another way of identifying the projects of interest this year is to look at the cost of research. These analyses are derived from Evaluate's Omnium R&D cost module, which provides an estimate of the cost of running a clinical trial. And as always, it makes really interesting reading. Disease areas that require a vast and lengthy cardiovascular outcome trials to prove a drug's safety are always going to rank highly in this kind of analysis. And really, this explains the inclusion of Lilly's tirzepatide and Novartis's Elencarsen. investors are keeping a real strong eye out for the interim readout on the pelacarsen in the second half of 2022. Roche has run, looking at Roche, they have run a bigger program than many others on the amyloid beta mAbs developers with gantenerumab. So in terms of sunk costs, it's got much more to lose than its rivals should the regulatory winds change around Alzheimer's disease. So potentially some risk there. And looking at islatravir, which is Merck's big bet in the long-acting HIV antiviral space. Those safety concerns did emerge late in 2021. Any possible impact of that has not really been seen yet. Just thinking about elsewhere, success in the respiratory disorder, RSV, is hugely important for GlaxoSmithKline, which, as we mentioned earlier, struggling to revive a bit of investor support here. So pivotal RSV data are due early this year from GSK and other players also in the space, actually. So the respiratory disease area is certainly an area to keep an eye on and watch throughout 2022. And in terms of extending the reach of already marketed drugs, developers do continue to invest heavily in the PD-1 and the PD-1 mAb space. The sums still being spent here demonstrate just how seriously the risk of low-cost competition should be taken, particularly in the current economic environment. So let's switch now and take a look at the regulatory environment. Obviously, COVID-19 has brought the regulatory process much more into public consciousness than ever before. And I think really the big question is whether the accelerated processes we saw for COVID-19 vaccines and treatments will have a long-term impact. We may start to see more collaborations between big pharma groups. That may just be talk rather than action. Who knows? That remains to be seen. But perhaps what's unlikely to change significantly in 2022 is the regulatory climate in the US. It's actually widely considered that the FDA is in a sort of pretty industry-friendly phase, and the body is showing few signs of significantly shifting that stance. It continues to show a lot of willingness when it comes to quickly ushering in medical breakthroughs, particularly in cancer. However, the controversial green light for Biogen's Alzheimer's therapy, Aduhelm, is now probably widely seen as leniency may be taken too far. So the agency might be more wary of handing out accelerated approvals for products without compelling evidence from clinical trials. The FDA has also shown it does still have some teeth with knockbacks for projects like Biogen's roxadustat, a novel anemia pill that raised concerns around cardiotoxicity. Notably, this is particularly true in areas where options already exist, even if these options aren't perfect. And one other consideration to bear in mind is that the FDA delayed several applications in 2021 because COVID-19 just simply prevented travel and therefore site inspections. As we look at our analysis, it shows that 2021 was in line with recent years in terms of novel drug approvals. The pandemic did not have as big an impact on the regulatory world as many had feared, and this worry is likely to dissipate further this year. Again, it's that sense of getting back to business as usual as we all learn to live with COVID-19. Now let's step away a little bit from the drug development side of things and look at the trends on the business end of the sector. Share price performance of large and small cap drug developers diverged over the course of 2021, and it looks like that's a trend that's going to continue into early 2022. As I mentioned at the start, several bigger groups are being rewarded for COVID-19 and other clinical successes, but earlier stage and higher risk biotechs are, for now, out of favour. And this is evident from the relative performance of three closely watched funds. Firstly, the XBI, which tracks small cap biotechs, then the XLV, which focuses on larger healthcare groups, and then finally the RSP, which of course tracks the cross-sector S&P 500. So the pandemic outbreak and the swift recovery staged by healthcare stocks is clear in this chart, with the smaller groups in the XBI being propelled into bubble territory. That bubble burst in February 21, and as far as investors are concerned, small cap biotech is now in the bear market area, with many anticipating further declines. I think it's fair to say most investors believe that the IPO window opened a little bit too wide, allowing too many early stage developers to float. And others point to a quieter M&A this year. And of course, the spectre of rising inflation, as we've mentioned already, around the globe is also troubling the markets. Having said that, you could argue that the small cap sector is returning to more sustainable levels. The declines we've seen are from heady heights indeed, and many hope that a retreat in valuations will persuade buyers back to the table. Let's look at the IPO markets. The biopharma financing ecosystem relies on healthy IPO markets, but a deterioration is actually widely expected this year. As I just mentioned, some investors believe that the IPO window did open too wide and that too many early stage and in some cases low quality developers were allowed to float. It's easy to appreciate how this could end up actually damaging the sector's reputations. Bankers must hope that they have delivered enough wins in the market to keep the investors happy. But there are reasons to be cheerful though, and there are certainly success stories to be found amongst recent new arrivals. Pandemic gainers like Moderna and the BioNTech stand out, of course, though it is notable that one of the best performers, Kodiak Sciences, is not a COVID-19 play at all. The company is the owner of one of Biopharma's most valuable R&D projects, the macular degeneration asset KSI 301. All that being said, the fourth quarter of 21 commenced with a really healthy flow of flotations, making 21 another record-breaking year, with $14.2 billion raised in the year on Western exchanges. So how long investor demand can hold up is probably fair to say it's a big unknown here. That will depend on the wider stock market conditions and how the sector's newly listed companies perform in the coming months. So what about SPACs? SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies, another way for private biopharma companies to enter the public markets. And there's been a lot of hype around this recently, and it's certainly something that many investors are looking at, and indeed many of them have already called on them. 2022 should give us a clearer sense of whether they're going to have any serious role to play in biotech financing in the longer term. You're probably aware they're also referred to as blank check companies, and they are listed cash shells that offer private groups an alternative route to a stock market listing affected by an acquisition. I'm pretty sure that the performance of those that have already closed a deal will be monitored during 22 to help determine whether SPACs are actually able to deliver high quality companies to the market. So far, and in all honesty, their track record is not particularly impressive. Of the 18 drug developers that have floated via a SPAC since the start of 22, only 4 have seen share prices rise since their respective deals closed. And only one, Cerebral, is a real success story. I suppose in fairness, though, it may just be that we need more time to see how those SPACs prove themselves. And of course, the traditional IPO has also been disappointing. So it's really certainly too early to declare SPACs a failure. Let's keep an eye on that one. The other element to consider is the new SEC regulations that could also diminish SPACs prospects this year. We're expecting the US financial regulator to tighten rules around financial guidance, conflicts of interest, and transparency of disclosures, amongst others. So whether or not we're still talking about SPACs in a couple of years remains to be seen. Let's move on to venture financing and indeed to exits. Now, IPO markets may be displaying signs of slowing, but the venture capital space is showing nothing of the sort. There will be some impact if we do find that fewer biotech flotations happen, because this will mean fewer crossover rounds. But these large pre-IPO investments have helped to really swell the top line numbers in terms of sums raised in recent years. But in many areas, private valuations are higher than in the public sphere, so big financings are likely still to be a feature of the venture landscape as we go through into 22. All this largesse means that concerns about overinvestment and inflated valuations persist in the venture capital world, particularly in the US and in certain competitive spaces like cancer and immunology. That all said, large developers remain enthusiastic buyers in these areas, and while the cash keeps flowing, private biotechs and their backers look set to remain in a strong position during 2022. So I don't think there's too much cause for concern here. Finally, we're seeing further bolstering of the venture industry through quickening investment cycles. The median time it takes to either float or sell a startup is definitely reducing. This is readily apparent for IPOs, albeit reflecting the recent IPO boom on which venture investors have been quick to capitalise. Let's move on to biopharma or the biopharma buyouts and that landscape. Hopes are high that many developers will consider selling in 2022, their hands being forced by retreating valuations and deteriorating equity markets. The strong financing climate has meant that young startups have been able to really push on alone, and an independent streak that, as I'm sure you're aware, has contributed to a very quiet period for M&A. One of the elements putting off buyers has been some of the sky-high valuations. Again, this is a situation that has started to resolve itself in the public sphere at least, but it means that when takeouts have happened, buyers have had to swallow some pretty rich premiums. Overall, premiums for R&D stage companies do seem to have moderated since 2019 when there was a real peak there, although they're still hovering at around 100%. And the apparent jump in the premiums being paid for commercial stage entities must be caveated by the very small number involved here. Only 5 of these buyouts happened during 21, compared to other years in the analysis, which each registered between 11 and 15 such deals. So we're actually looking at a really small pool of deals to reflect on here. Moving on to licensing, which is rather a different situation in terms of activity. High valuations might be curbing company buyouts, but developers are still busily accessing external innovation via licensing. A notable increase in the average upfront paid over the past 5 years shows that this area of deal making has not avoided price inflation, though buyers are at least hedging some of that risk. I should note that this analysis concerns only deals in which the upfront payment was disclosed. This figure is announced in only about a quarter of licensing transactions, so the real volume of activity is much, much higher there than this chart suggests. Future milestones are far from guaranteed, however, so focusing on total deal values or so-called bio dollars won't accurately reflect the actual amount of money changing hands each year. And on this basis, the average upfront paid was $59 million in 2017, according to Biopharma, a sum that climbed as far as $76 million in 2019 and has remained at that level, including over the first 4 quarters of 2021. With smaller developers still very cash-rich after years of plenty, the biopharma sector is likely to remain a seller's market in 22. And a look at the largest upfront payments in recent years shows that the higher competitive cancer space has been largely responsible for driving prices higher. So let me wrap up this part of the session with a quick summary. Biopharma will continue to make advances in the COVID-19 battle this year, and this will bring both benefits, largely in the shape of investor interest and heightened scrutiny, particularly for those that are making billions from successful pandemic vaccines and treatments. What companies intend to spend their profits on will be a major area of focus in 22. Pricing pressures will be another area to watch, likely coming from within the sector. The first real competition is threatening to emerge in oncology, highly lucrative checkpoint inhibitor space, with several Chinese developers partnering with global majors poised to launch low-cost anti-PDL antibodies. This is really only the first of many high-cost therapy areas in the sights of those hoping to grab market share by cutting prices, and this issue will become more prominent as 22 progresses. Personally, I think this will be a really fascinating area to keep an eye on. In terms of other therapy areas to focus on, I think those that will see most activity on are Alzheimer's disease, with several projects hoping to join Aduhelm on the market. But this might be a little bit harder for them, with, as we've talked, with the demand for more evidence around efficacy, particularly around cognition and function. RSV might also see its first success after years of failure, and cancer will continue to be very, very closely followed, with late-stage data from the TIGIT antibodies of particular interest. After years of plenty, the drug development sector is, for the most part, in a good place. Smaller companies are well funded, many larger developers are riding high on COVID-19 successes, and the venture capital industry is poised to deploy significant capital. The effects on inflation and the impact of COVID-19 on R&D do remain to be seen, but will certainly add a certain je ne sais quoi to what you're going to see happening in 2022. So that's all from our analysis for now. I hope I've been able to provide you with some good food for thought as we move into 2022. As we mentioned earlier, I am joined by my colleague, Lisa Erkwat, who's the editor of our Evaluate Vantage team of journalists. So hopefully, if we have a bit of time, I think we have a bit, we'll be happy to take a few questions.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Deborah, you, as well as the team, your team, for the excellent presentation. We will be sharing Deborah's presentation on our closed LinkedIn site, but we will also be making sure that everybody who's attended today's presentation gets a copy of that, so they can reach out to Deborah's team with any further questions or comments that you have.